Great. Welcome back. So we are going to have an in-conversation masterclass with Hannah Khalil as part of the 37 Plays playwriting project. And I'm going to introduce Hannah and give you a little outline of her work to date. Pitch in, miss anyone. And then we're going to plunge in and have a conversation about process, about playwriting process. So Hannah, you're currently writer-in-residence at the Globe Theatre in London. And you've got a play that's in rehearsals, about to go into tech, which is a version or adaptation of Henry VIII, a Shakespeare play that you've essentially co-written, but with a gap of 400 years, which we'll come back to and talk about. And also, you had a beautiful show on in the main space at the Globe called The Fir Tree, didn't you?
I did, at Christmas.
At Christmas. And previous to that, you had a very brilliantly received show on at the Royal Shakespeare Company in the Swan Theatre, which we worked together on very closely. And you've done a lot, you've had a lot of productions actually. You had Interference was on at the National Theatre of Scotland. You had, Scartest was on at Soho, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you've written for radio and TV and film.
Yes.
And we did a podcast with Mark Ravenhill a few months ago that's on the 37 Plays website. And what Mark asked you to do was to pick one of his tips. He'd written 101 tips on playwriting. And you picked number 5, which, I'm going to read it out, which was, for a theatre play, an hour of playing time is 9,000 to 10,000 words. Basic, but no one tells you this. Think in minutes. After 1,000 words, the audience are 6 minutes into the play, and so on. Writing a play is sculpting in time. So I was going to ask you a little bit about the fact that you'd picked that tip out of the 101 that there are. But it struck me that the idea of sculpting time in a play, there are actually 3 parts to that. Mm-hmm. One is how you use the time you have with the audience, the actual 3 hours or 2 hours you have, and when you release information and plot. Mm-hmm. The other is how you use time in the structure of the play to reveal things. Mm-hmm. And the other is how time operates in the world of the play. So can you talk a little bit about the process of how you decide when the events of the story you want to tell are revealed to the audience?
So, hi everybody. The first thing I want to say is that I really don't think there are any hard and fast rules. I think it's really important to remember that everyone has their own way of doing things, and I think pretty much with every single play I've written, I've approached it slightly differently depending on the play and what feels like what's necessary for that play. Be very suspicious of anyone who tells you they have the secret formula. They don't. There is no secret formula. But it's about sort of taking what's useful for you and applying that. Like, you know, we talk about the writer's toolbox. You might not even need to open it. It might be, everything might flow so beautifully, it'll be fine. But if you're stuck or if there's something you want to try that's a bit different, you know, to open up. And there are so many amazing resources on that website. And, you know, the interviews with Mark and different writers, I have found them really inspiring. So, yeah, that's the first thing I just wanted to say. So in terms of how do you decide? Well, it's a bit similar to how you decide what structure to use, I think. And for me, that's different depending on the play and the story you're trying to tell. And I love it if you can somehow reveal something about the play, the question the plays aren't asking, through the form of the play. So, and sometimes it's really obvious how that's going to happen and how that should work. And sometimes it's not. It sort of comes to you in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, or when you're watching a TV show, or you're walking in the woods, or whatever. So I think the best way that I can talk about it is by giving examples. So, for example, Museum in Baghdad, the play that I had on at the Swan, that started life as, I thought it was a play about Gertrude Bell, who was an aristocrat, an explorer, this amazing woman who travelled all around the Middle East and was a contemporary of Lawrence of Arabia's. And I didn't know anything about her, and was so annoyed with myself that I didn't, that I did loads of research, and then was like, well, this is all fascinating, and so I have to write a play about Gertrude Bell. Always be very cautious if you've done a lot of research, because you think you have to show all your homework, but you really don't. So the first few drafts were very turgid, boring, biopic sort of pieces about Gertrude and her life. And then around the same time, I went to an amazing place in London, in Gough Square, called the Arab British Centre, where there was a talk being given by an Iraqi archaeologist. And she did this slideshow of all the pieces of antiquity that had been stolen from the museum, some that had been returned, some that had been destroyed. And I was like, this is amazing. I'm even getting goosebumps talking about it. I was like, this is amazing. Oh my goodness, that those are pieces that Gertrude would possibly have been in contact with. She's the person who set up the museum in the first place. And this amazing archaeologist ended her talk with a photograph of the caretaker of the museum. And she said, I always end my talks with a photo of the caretaker, because it feels like he will always be there, and like he has always been there. And it was one of these amazing, like, there probably was a real light bulb appeared over my head at that moment, because I just went, oh, here I've been thinking I'm writing a play about Gertrude Bell, but I'm not. I'm writing a play about the museum. And it needs to talk about the museum being born, so Gertrude is key, but it needs to talk about what happened, you know, during the looting. So I need to have two times. And there's the way that I link them together. That caretaker, she's just told me he was always there. He's always going to be there. And so I wrote the first play that I had written that has a character that exists in a liminal space. He's everywhere, all times. He's kind of a ghost. I never thought, if you'd said to me, would you ever write a character who is like a Time Lord, I suppose, I would say probably not. I mean, if they offered me a Doctor Who gig, you know, I'd take it. But I never thought that I would write that. And so that became very exciting, because I could use both times and he could straddle them. And what I was trying to explore in the play is how our attitudes to artefacts work. Why artefacts are important when people are dying. And that's something that we have to look at the past in order to sort of interrogate.
So time in that particular play was so much a part of the question that you were asking. It became, the way of unearthing that was by embedding shifts of time into the story, into the structure of the story.
Yes. And even to the point where we have this magical character who is trying to change the course of the events into the future. So he tries to change things in the moment, replay a moment again and again to see if he can change how the tick-on effect will happen in a timeline.
We'll come back to that later, because there's a few elephant traps along the way when you have a structure like that.
Yes.
Do you think there are, though, secret rules, like you need a really big emotional twist just before the interval, or you need a massive theatrical event to happen, you know, in the final quarter of the play? Do you think that those things are helpful as anchors, or are they just a big red herring?
I think if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, I would have said, no, there are no rules. You shouldn't have to do anything like that. You do whatever the hell you want. But the reality is, even if you're doing something quite different, even if you're not writing a linear narrative play with 3 acts that goes, I am on a quest to go and find the Holy Grail, and these are my obstacles, and even if it's not that kind of play, even if you fragment reality, even if you're moving backwards in time, or something really meta, the truth is that in order to have a satisfying experience, I think, as an audience member, you need to be taken on an emotional journey. And the way you can do those climaxes or those reveals doesn't have to be in the most traditional way. It doesn't have to be the way it happens in Chekhov or in Ibsen. But I think you need to try and, well, I think even if you're not trying to, what you're trying to do is create an interesting experience for an audience member. And in doing so, you will end up doing it. So my play Scenes from 68 Years, which is literally loads and loads and loads and loads of scenes, just scenes about life living under occupation in Palestine, trying to figure out the order of how to put those scenes when it's about telling a community story rather than an individual's. I realised that actually about 2/3 of the way through, I needed to have the most explosive scene of the play. And that's a scene of a protest. That's where it had to live. It just didn't work anywhere else. And it would be the place where you traditionally have the climax of the play.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And then the scene where the whole community comes together, well, that had to go at the end. It just had to.
So there is a pattern whereby you can see a rhythm in terms of how you use the time with your audience. If you looked at it in that way, you might say, okay, so there are 2 anchors there. There's a resolution and there's a big something explosive moment. And that actually is really helpful in terms of how you shape the order of events when you're beginning to think about writing the play.
But what's also so useful about Mark's comment about sculpting time and literally knowing that this many words is this long, because you never have a sense when you're writing on the page, it's like, oh, look at all those words. I mean, how did I write all those words? That's a very long monologue. That's got to be about at least 10 minutes. And of course, it's nothing like that. So at what point have you earned certain things? So, for example, I would say, and again, not a rule, but I would be very careful about starting a play with a monologue, because I feel like you've got to really capture your audience have come and you don't know where they've come from, you don't know what they've just eaten, you don't know who they've just had a fight with in the street. They need to come. There's this beautiful thing that happens in theatre, which is why we want to write for theatre, this idea that all our hearts start to beat at the same moment, in the same time, because we're all together. But that doesn't just happen like that. People need a moment to arrive. And
what is it about a monologue that
well, it depends.
I'm going to push you there. What is it about that doesn't have that effect?
It totally depends on the monologue. I'm saying there's no rules. It could be if it's a really compelling character who shouts at you and brings you into the play in a really exciting way. But if it's something that feels like it's telling us things, great truths about the world or about the characters or about the play, I would argue that you should give the audience a little bit of time to get to know the world potentially before that happens.
You're warming us up.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got you.
And to have a sense of kind of how many pages in, how long have they been getting to know this place, this story. I think it's really helpful, really, really helpful.
So another question I have for you is about, which I think is linked to that, is about sculpting emotional time for your audience. So projecting how you want your audience to receive information and how you want them to feel when a character says something or there's a dramatic moment in the play. Is that something you think that you have an eye on before you're writing? Like, is there a timeline? Is there a spider chart on your wall? Or is that something that happens as you write and as you get to know your characters? Or is it something that comes in later when you're redrafting?
I think for me, I think I'm different from quite a lot of other professional writers who I know, who really hate the first draft. They feel like it's very frightening and unwieldy, and it's always only going to be like vomiting on the page, and then you have to really sort of clean it. That's my words, not theirs. But I absolutely love the first draft because there's something for me that's so pure about it, because I tend not to do a lot of writing down planning. Right. I do a lot of thinking, a lot of thinking, a lot of research. I always try now and have a sense of what the central question of the play is. It's always really hard. Retrospectively, it's always easy. So, as I said, for museum, why are artefacts important when people are dying? A really clear central question of something that you want to explore, which will act as your anchor, so you don't suddenly start drifting off downstream into something that is not helpful. But the first draft, I find something really pure and lovely about just getting on the page all these things that have been in my head. I'll have an idea for the story, I'll have an idea of who the characters are. They might take me off in some different directions, but I'll keep looking at my post-it note that says what the central question is. And when it's finished, and I write, lights down or the end or whatever I write at the end, I'm like, that is never going to be more brilliant, because it's just me and that. And as soon as I show it to someone else, they'll tell me what's wrong with it. Because, of course, there will be myriad things wrong with it. But I love the purity of the first draft. For me, that's the joy. The work starts then. Yeah. Because then I have to try and understand what I've... Because there's also, I feel like there's something... I have to be careful about the word I use, but there's a sort of creative force that goes on that you... When we were doing that exercise earlier and you say, I write because... I write because, I write because. I was really interested that I was saying things like, I write because I'm in control. I write because it's my private space. I write because I'm the world builder. I make it all. And there's something so pure about that. But then you have to start looking at what's happened. What has your brain done? Where are the clever things? Where are the things that are not helpful? And begin to sculpt the words on the page, and using time and other things to do that. So I think a lot of it, long answer to your question,
it's a brilliant
is that I think it's in the rewriting for me that the not creative bit of my brain entirely, of course it's creative, but not purely creative. It's more like the problem-solving bit of my brain.
So that's when you go back through and you're thinking, okay, there's far too much here that's the same tone or the same atmosphere or the same emotional register. Yeah. I need to change it up. I need to have a look at that section.
Exactly.
Can you talk a little bit about your play Scar Test? Because it does something very unexpected, doesn't it, to the audience quite early on that I think emotionally reframes the way they receive the story.
Yeah. So the Scar Test is a play that was at Soho a few years ago, and it's about the experience of women in detention in this country. And I really like to write community plays. I like to watch ensemble plays. And so this is very much a community play in terms of it's talking about all the women who are incarcerated in a detention centre. But I sort of wanted to give the audience a feeling of what that might be like. Now, of course, I can't do that because we're privileged and we're able to go to the theatre. But to sort of try and catch them unawares by something. So I had the idea that I would set the play up and we meet one character who's entering into this detention centre. And of course, because we're storytellers, all of us, in our brains and hearts, so we're going in with this lady, so we're going to find out about her story, find out a little bit about her. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, she is deported. So she's carried off screaming, and that's it. And we never find out what happens to her. And obviously the play continues because we, look at other characters. But to set up what seems to, my intention was to set up what seems like it's going to be a traditional narrative, and then undercut the audience's expectation to go, and no, you don't get to find out what happens to her, because that's true. That's the truth of it. There are people who are deported, and we don't find out what happens to them. And so with that play, I really wanted people to think hard about the way that we treat people who come to this country seeking asylum. And I also wanted to try and provoke a reaction that would think, what? Oh my goodness, how is this allowed to happen? And to maybe annoy people into wanting to do something about it.
So do you think, at what point in your experience of mingling with the audience incognito during the interval, which obviously you do a lot.
Awful thing to do.
But at what point, generally, did that emotional bombshell land with the audience? Was it at the end of the play? Are they waiting for her to come back all the way through the play? Wow.
I think so. I think they are. Or they're looking for the story, the single narrative that will replace and fulfill that missing narrative.
So it's at the end of the story, when they get up to leave,
they realise
they're not going to find out.
They're not getting it.
They're not
going to find out what happens to her.
And that's amazing. And were they cross?
Luckily not. I mean, this is the other thing you have to be really mindful of. I want an audience to lean forward. I want an audience to be interested, to be engaged, to have to do a bit of work, not sit back and just be like, oh, this is great, I'll have another drink. Oh, what time's, okay, we've got, to try and sort of keep people really engaged. But also, I feel like you have to, you're creating a set of rules in your play and a contract with the audience, and you just mustn't mess it up. They're giving up their time and their money to come and sit and listen to characters that you've made. So there's a huge responsibility. And so I think people want to be provoked and asked to think about things. But I think it's a two-way relationship, and there has to be respect there. I get cross as an audience member if I feel like certain things have been set up within a play and then they're thrown back in my face in some way or another. So if a performer sets up something and then makes the audience feel guilty or implicated some way, in a way that feels that wasn't part of the bargain here.
So you think that there is a contract, isn't there, between the playwright and the audience in terms of what the rules are. So just briefly talking about time again and how it operates, I've spoken to writers in the past who said, essentially, if you're going to jump forwards or if you're going to jump around in time in the story, you've got to be really careful how many times you do that and how many directions you go. So but the audience need to kind of get a sense of what that's going to be quite early on in order to follow the story. Otherwise, you'll lose them, and everybody knows what it's like to have a really frustrating night in the theatre where they've lost the thread of the story, and it's just they've lost it for too long to be able to be brought back in. Do you think there are rules about that?
I think you have to just be really careful about if you're going to do something that feels out of keeping or feels a little bit explosive or unusual. If you're going to have a play that looks like a linear narrative play and you're suddenly going to explode it with an event that suddenly freezes time or that suddenly you're 100 years in the future, I think you need to really be careful and make sure that the timing of that is right.
Yeah.
But also sometimes that you seed something early on that just gives us, oh, that's why that was there. Okay, that just gives us a little sense of something that might be coming, potentially.
A little breadcrumb.
Yeah,
that you can
a little breadcrumb.
I want to talk a bit about your play, Scenes from 68 Years. It's a really extraordinary piece of work. And it is essentially, you referred to it earlier, it's a collection of stories. And what I wanted to ask is how you chose the way to structure that play, rather than focus on like one moment in time, or a chronological story over a much shorter period, because that's 68 years. You know, that's an astonishing achievement, but also it's very ambitious. So how did that come about?
So all the stories in Scenes from 68 Years were given to me by people. They came and said, this is what happened to my family, this is what's happening to my family. Even from my own family, my dad came and said, oh, by the way, our surname's not actually Khalil. When I went to the passport office in Jerusalem in the 60s, they just said my name was too long and drew a line. So you've been going by the wrong name all these years. So all these amazing stories that had come out. And I was like, if I write each one of these as a play, which potentially you could do, then that's a life's work and I don't get to do anything else. So I thought, well, I'll try and put them all into a play. I mean, that seems like a huge task. But it's a bit like when I'm helping my daughter with her maths homework. I can't quite look at the long question and know exactly all the steps I'm going to take to get to the end, but I know the first step. And then the first step will lead to the second step, to the third, to the fourth. And then we'll get the answer eventually. There will be some bickering, but we'll get there. But so in a similar vein, I sort of knew, okay, I have to write them as scenes. And in a similar way as what I was describing with Scar Test, I thought, is there a way to make the audience feel a little bit unnerved in the way it might feel if you're living under occupation, where a situation can go from being very calm and domestic, very quickly change to being something more threatening and different. You have to be on your toes, you can't relax. So how do I do that? So with every scene, I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this scene, this story within the scene. And I'm going to challenge myself to set up the situation so the audience go, oh yeah, I know what this is. And by the end of the scene, have subverted it in some way that the rug is pulled out. So then you're like, oh, hold on a minute, that's not what I thought this was. And to keep doing that again and again and again. Sort of the short film trick, you know, really great short films. They set up a narrative, you're like, oh, I know what this is, and then there's a beautiful twist. Try and do that lots. Did that. That was joyous. That was really fun. Really lovely challenge. Then I was like, oh my goodness. I have 30-something scenes. How do I order these into a play?
Right.
So then it's sort of a bit like blind man's buff. So it's like I have an instinct. I feel like, okay, so I need a scene that draws us in at the beginning. And then I need something that has some weight and excitement about 2/3 of the way through, and I know what's going at the end. And then put them in order, try them in this order, invite friends round for dinner, give them a few drinks, and then say, oh, could we just
do a play reading before putting?
Oh, really, Hannah, again? Yeah, just need to hear just these 4 scenes in this order. And then be like, it's not. Could we just swap them? So, but genuinely, it's that, and with a play like that, and workshops, and then readings in front of an audience. So initially, with that play, I wanted every single character in each scene to be completely unrelated to each other. So, but there are about 50 characters in that play, so you can't have 50 actors, even at the RSC. So, you have 8 actors for a reading, or you have 10 actors if you're lucky for a reading. You have actors playing 2 parts. And very quickly I realised whether I wanted them to or not, the audience were going, oh, isn't that interesting that that guy from that scene comes back and he's actually a taxi driver. That's really fun. And I was like, hold on. They're making narrative kind of leaps that I haven't intended. I need to control that. So then actually I did have characters coming back. So that led me down that path. And then also watching the reaction of the audience.
Yeah.
Or sitting. I mean, it's really hard as a writer sitting in an audience because people don't know who you are. And they're very honest if they don't know who you are. So I would sit and watch the reading and listen and watch their reaction. You're like, no, that's not working. Okay, we need to. But it went through lots and lots of workshops and readings, even right up when we opened at the Arcola. In previews, we were still cutting scenes, feeling like that's too long. Or actually, now there's a point also, and we talked about this with Museum. There's sort of a point towards, like the last seventh of a play, where you've unleashed something and it needs to get to the end. Yeah. And I know as an audience member, if I'm sat there and going, now we need to just get to the end, and it doesn't, it drives me mad. So all of those things. But yeah, that's the reality. Yeah. So if you're writing a play, it doesn't have to be professional actors. It can be friends, dinner, much cheaper than hiring actors. Make them a nice meal, give them a few drinks. Everyone's a good actor after a few drinks, for you and them. And then, and then just hear it read, or over a cup of tea, or, Yeah, I think that really helps.
There's a jeopardy, isn't there, if you're writing a play that structurally plays around with time, if you redraft it. Because I remember we got in a terrible pickle with a museum in Baghdad where you were rewriting and then suddenly you'd unpicked a stitch and the rest of the play didn't make sense, or the 3 scenes before didn't make sense. And it's really delicate. You do have to be aware of how decisions you make in redrafting impact on the narrative, either later or earlier. It felt like there was one point where we were it was like we were shuffling scenes to see what happened. And then we realised really quickly
You've got to be careful.
What happened.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah. It's like Doctor Who or like Back to the Future. If you change something in the past, it has a ripple effect. Whatever the shape of the play is, it's going to affect. So yeah, it's a very difficult, dangerous business.
So many things I want to ask you. This is a good one. In terms of finding inspiration for what you want to write about, do you have ideas that move at different speeds? I mean, there are some ideas for plays that really sit bubbling on the back burner, and are there others that just come super quick and it comes out whole?
Yes. Yeah. No, there are, and it's really interesting because I used to feel quite disloyal about working on something and then having an idea for something else and moving onto that before finishing the first thing. But actually, some things there is so much to be said for putting something in a drawer for a little while and coming back to it later and looking at it with fresh eyes, because it's really easy to be very wedded to things, but anything that you cut doesn't have to go forever. There was a scene in Scenes which I did not want to cut. I thought it was so beautiful. It's a woman stitching a massive quilt while telling this beautiful traditional Palestinian story to her 2 children. And Chris, the director, kept saying to me, that's just holding things up now, that scene. It's nice and everything, but we need to cut it. And I was like, no, it's so good. It's such a beautiful scene. It's really well written. I don't want to lose that scene. And he's like, it's got to go. It's got to go. It's just holding things up. It doesn't belong. Doesn't belong.
Was he right?
He bloody was. It was annoying. Yeah, he was right. But I took it out. I put it in the drawer or in the file. And it's in another play now.
It came up in another play?
It's in another play. So never throw anything away, ever, 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 because you'll come back to it. And even if you've written something you think that is the worst thing I've ever written in my life, give it 2 weeks and come back to it. Like, you might see it differently. I never throw anything away. I mean, that's why my office is such a state. I mean, I have piles of papers everywhere. I don't like throwing things away, like bits of writing. It feels really important to hold on to them. Yeah. Because they do find new life in different places. Yeah. They just do.
Okay, I've got one last one for you before we open it up to the floor. And this refers back to the idea of you using your relationship with the audience as a writer to guide how they feel and how their feelings might alter through the play. And I wondered whether you'd had an experience where you had written a scene or an event or a line in a play that you'd expected to elicit a particular emotion from the audience, and the opposite had happened, or indeed, like, you know, when you give the play to actors in a read-through, and they sort of go totally the opposite, with completely different interpretation from what you thought you'd written. What do you do in that event? Like, how does it impact how you approach the play?
It happens lots. I mean, the most obvious place it happens is with comedy. If I ever try and write something funny, it always falls flat on its face. If I write something that I think I don't know is funny, people will find it hilarious. So I think just not trying to write comedy is a good thing for me, not for anybody else, just personally. But I think writing truth is the most important thing. But I think you have to trust an audience's reaction. They're not wrong, unfortunately. And sometimes also you might do something better than you expect. So the final scene of scenes is meant to elicit an emotional response from an audience. It's meant to make you feel, it's sort of supposed to crystallise the whole experience of seeing the play. I was shocked at how upset people were at the end of the play, and I felt really bad about it, actually. I don't want people crying after my work. I want them to be happy. But I think the reason they got so emotional is because the play is full of laughs, and it does leave you feeling a bit out of kilter if you're laughing at things that maybe you didn't expect or don't think it's necessarily okay to laugh at. So yeah, I think you must always, and when I say an audience's reaction, I don't necessarily mean a reader's reaction. If someone reads your work and gives you notes, for me there's 3 kinds of notes. There's the note that you know is right, because deep in your heart you know it, but you didn't want to do it. You didn't want to cut that character, they're great. But if someone else says it and you're like, yeah, I know, oh no, I'm actually going to have to do that now, aren't I? Then there's the note that tells you that that person doesn't understand your play, doesn't understand what you're trying to do. So you can disregard that note and everything else they say to you. That's great. You're like, yeah, and you just very politely, oh, that's interesting, I hadn't thought of that. No, I'm not listening to any of your notes because you don't understand what I'm doing. That's fine. And then the third kind of note is the note that you haven't thought of, that's interesting. And the instinct with those, depending on your personality, for me, my instinct is always, oh, they must be right. Not necessarily, but that's one to sit with and really think about before you action it.
Sleep on that one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, notes from individuals who have read the play, that's a different story. But if you are with an audience, you can feel what's working and what's not working, and if it's not working, it's not their fault, it's yours. I hate to say that, but it's true.
It's true.
So you need to kind of try and understand why things aren't working. And sometimes a really good thing someone said to me once was also really trust actors. So if an actor has got a beef with a line, if there's one line that they're having real trouble with, or something, they're like, this isn't working, don't dismiss that. Even if you think that line is great or perfect, have a look at about a scene before. Go a little bit earlier and just check that journey or check what's happened before, because it might not be that might be the site of the pain, but the actual problem is in a slightly different location.
Yeah, that's really
I think that's really great advice,
yeah.
and I've found that's really borne out to be true in the past.
Yeah. Has anyone got any questions for us?
When you're writing, do you find that you write more for yourself or for the audience?
That's a really good question. Do I write for myself or do I write for the audience? I don't think... So what's really useful for me when I'm writing, particularly if I'm writing about things that I'm scared about, which sometimes I am, or you know, there's a character in it who's totally based on someone I know and I'm really scared that they'll realise it. Or I'm writing about something that feels really hot and really like it might be controversial or upset people. what I do is I always tell myself the play will never be produced. So when I'm writing it, I'm like, no one's ever going to see this. I can write what I like. No one will ever produce this. I mean, it's more difficult if you're under commission, or God forbid if they're already selling tickets and you haven't written the thing. But the reality is, yeah, I try and convince myself, like, turn something off in my brain that goes, this is all just about my relationship to this story in the first instance. But then, and probably for the first draft, to sort of free myself so I don't. And then when it comes to the editing, sculpting bit in draft 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I've stopped putting numbers on drafts. I date them because it just gets too depressing. Pippa once saw my museum in Baghdad file and went, how many drafts have you? I just don't look. Yeah, then you can begin to think about an audience and how, and how. But it's so difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, what is an audience? It's always going to be different. It's a different group of people. It depends on the theatre, on the play, on the night,
on the form.
Exactly, you know. Which is what's so beautiful and unique about it. But that said, I guess when I'm thinking about the audience, I'm thinking about how I would receive this if I was watching it. And yeah, and that conversation happens after the first draft, I think. So I guess I'm saying that sounds quite selfish. I write for myself first, and then for an audience. But I hope that in writing for myself, it makes the play better, or makes me be looser and freer with how I express.
Well, it means you don't censor yourself.
That's
in
it.
that draft.
Yeah.
And that's really important, because what does tend to come out in the first draft is it's clear what you're trying to get at in the first draft, even if you don't arrive. It's clear in the DNA what it is you're trying to do. Yeah.
Great question, thank you.
Great question, yeah.
Whenever you're researching, do you have a specific question that you want to answer in the research? So for instance, say you were researching the Spanish community moving to England, how would you try to have a question about a specific part of that, or in a specific area?
That's a really good question. Research has been a really big part of my writing life, and I really love it because it's a way of, you know, writing can be very insular and very lonely. I think what I try and do is not necessarily, if I decide I want to write about a particular subject, trying to drill down into what the question that I want to answer, but then when I'm actually doing the research, being as open and as free to be led in slightly different directions, because I suppose it might be a bit like being a documentary filmmaker who's already decided exactly what they want their film to be, which you can't really do. You have to be led by the material a little bit. But so I'm actually writing something about the people who immigrated to London, Irish people who came to London in the 50s and the 60s, my mum included, and in doing so have spent a lot of time talking to members of that community and lots of people in my family, and it's been really joyous because I've been quite careful about not having too particular. I mean, of course, there's some things I'm like, I really hope someone tells me a great story about, I don't know, whatever, and so, normally they don't, but they'll tell me a great story about something else that I had never even thought of. So I think actually in any research, just being as open as possible and not having made decisions. And in the same way that when you write your first draft, trying not to make too many decisions, because the characters and things that happen in the play might just lead you to something more interesting. And yeah.
How hard have you found writing for that era?
I love it. I've loved it.
Do you not worry that you won't be able to sort of conquer the vernacular that's used?
No, because it's not documentary. This is the thing, and this is the other. You know, like talking about Henry VIII. You know, like there's a big question around it. So I've adapted Henry VIII for the Globe, and it's based. I mean, it's the Shakespeare and Fletcher text, but the way Shakespeare has written that play is not exactly right historically. Like the way talking about time works, it shrinks like years and years worth of events into what feels like about 6 months. So I think what you've always got to remember is we're writing fiction, not documentary. So we can take liberties as long as you have a respect for the material, the source material, and the people that you're talking about. I think, and then also you can get to the point where you get the right actors in the room who are from that community, it's all about doing the work in the beginning, though. And I think if you've got any worries about anything, the best thing you can do is do more research and get hold of people who can help you, to tell stories, and make sure you're the right person to be telling those stories as well.
I mean, the other thing about what's really freeing about writing for theatre is that you could write a play about contemporary Irish culture in London in verse. You know, you can do whatever you, as long as the form with which you choose to write conveys what it is that you want to convey about that story. It doesn't have to be accurate, and in fact, really precise naturalism is really hard to pull off in a large space. So if you're writing for a really small studio, very precise, like hyper-realism and naturalistic dialogue can work brilliantly. But on a larger stage, it's really hard to receive that incredibly nuanced subtext, which is often physical or is often very slight in that type of language. So when you get onto a bigger stage or a more open stage or a thrust stage, you actually you need to release yourself from that anxiety, and you can write. You know, you can write in iambic pentameter. You know, you can write in slang. You can write in a made-up language. I mean, that's what we've been exploring today with some of those words that we looked at that were just made up by Shakespeare, or or words that you'd used, a Babylonian word that you'd found that you'd used in your play. There's an amazing freedom in playwriting.
There is, but if your chief sort of desire is to interrogate the language specifically, if it was me, I would then want to write a verbatim play. So I would make sure that I was interviewing people and taping them and getting their permission and then making something verbatim. Yeah. So there's ways, it depends on what's your priority. If you want to make it poetic, if you want to, as you say, how you're going to use language. I mean, one of my favourite things to do in theatre, I love writing monologues. I also like writing stage directions and scenes where there's no words at all. I think that's really exciting. And I really encourage you to be as brave and three-dimensional in thinking about your scripts as you like and as you can be. And I love to also think, it's the director's problem. So one of the final stage directions in Museum in Baghdad is sand begins to fall from the sky. It falls, it falls, it falls. It covers the whole stage. Gertrude gets into a glass cabinet. The cabinet fills with glass. Now the whole stage is sand. We can see nothing but sand. I mean, and I wrote that. I know no one's ever actually going to be able to do that or stage that, really.
Although we got pretty close.
But if it's the RSC, they're going to have a bloody good go at it. But it's a gesture. It's like an offer to a director. And as long as they get what you're trying to do, they'll find a way to make some theatre magic and pull that off. That's really some of the really exciting stuff, I think. Writing, I love writing dialogue. I love writing monologues, but I love writing challenges and being imaginative. So another bit in Scar Test. So with Scar Test, it felt very important. That's the play about women in detention. It felt really important to me that we did not talk about what happened to these women before they came to the UK, why they had come here, because that's not what the play was about. It was about how they're treated here. And I think there might be an expectation from some audience members that you would find out some of the horrors that had happened to these women. But the women who I met and interviewed were very clear that they were not victims, and they were also, I was reluctant to ask them what had happened. It's not my business what happened to them. If they offered it to me, that's a different story. But their lives, the things that they've had to deal with is theirs and theirs alone. But there was a moment in the play where a lawyer says to a young woman, "You have to tell me what happened to you. Otherwise, I can't help you." And I got to that point in the play and I went, oh, crikey, what do I do here? Do I just end the scene? I don't want her to start relating all the terrible things that happened to her. Like a feminist decision not to have violence depicted against women on stage. Like, we have enough of that on television and everywhere. What do I do? So, yeah, lots of ruminating, lots of baking cakes, lots of taking walks, doing maths homework. And then suddenly the idea came to me, and it was magpied from a show I had seen many, many years ago. A seed of an idea from another show. What she does in the play is she stands up, she opens her mouth, and we hear a soundscape of war. So she doesn't describe what happens to her, but we hear something that gives us a sense of where she's come from and what's happened. And then she flops back into the chair. And as a moment of theatre, that should be really powerful and exciting, and using the form in a really theatrical way. So trying to be thinking, why does this have to be a play? Why can I not just put a camera in front of it and it be a telly? I think that's really exciting for readers and audiences and directors, because of course you want your play to be in 3 dimensions, because that's the point. It's not meant to be read on the page, it's meant to be seen. So thinking like that is really exciting and important too, I think.
Sort of following on from that, do you feel like it's your responsibility, because you mentioned you had her standing up, opening her mouth, hearing the soundscape. How much is that your decision? How much is the director's decision? Because could you have just said she opens her mouth and then you need to be like, it's on you, what happens? But you wrote that, so, and do you find that hard to give those bits over to a director? A few questions there.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love working with directors and watching the way they solve the problems that I've set for them on the page. But I really do see things in space. I really imagine, I mean, it's an immense privilege when you're writing and you know the space that you're writing for, because that makes things so technicolor, you know, and you're so able to kind of judge how many people to have on stage at one time, and you can really see it. So I try and get as much of it on the page as possible, but I'm not entirely wedded to it. As long as I trust the director, it's really fun then to figure out how to make those things, how to make those things work. And in that case, it would be you'd need a really brilliant sound designer to make that work. So yeah, I think it's really collaborative. I think, yeah, everything on the page is suggestion, and you're wedded to it to a point, but it's all part of the collaboration with the team about how you realise that.
Well, how wedded you are to it is about how much of it you need to express that story beat. Like, there's a reason why you've chosen that rather than dialogue or a lighting change
or movement
or something else. So I think the negotiation is about, the offer is this is the story beat that this has to land.
Yes.
And the negotiation is exactly how to deliver that.
Exactly.
But it's not normally, the negotiation isn't normally about the story beat, I think.
I think that's right. It's about how you fully realise that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you ever give up on a play? And how do you convince yourself to persevere with a play?
Do I ever give up on a play? I always get to the end. But not necessarily in one sitting, not necessarily at the same time. It might be left for a little bit and then come, you know, there's things that go in the drawer and then come out again. But I think it's also really important to remember that for something to be a play, it doesn't need to be an hour and a half or 2 hours or 3 hours long.
It could be 5 minutes in
Exactly.
virtual reality, or it could be on TikTok, or it could be...
Some plays deserve, you know, what they need is a 30-minute, you know, one-act structure. Some are a 5-minute monologue. Sometimes, if you're writing something, when I was writing Museum, I got frustrated and blocked about some stuff in it. So I wrote a monologue that dealt with exactly the same themes, and it's a 10-page monologue that's, I always thought actually would make a nice curtain raiser, you know, one day to it. But so I think freeing ourselves of this notion that we're only writers if we get to the end of a 150-page play is nonsense. If you're writing anything, you're a writer, I would say. And I think maybe looking at something, and if you're struggling with it and you can't quite get to the end of it, like think about it. Have I chosen the right length for it? Have I chosen the right form for it? I started writing a play a few years ago that hasn't been performed. I hope it will. It's still in progress. It will continue to be in process. It started off as another sort of historical play that was a linear narrative, and then Chris read it and said, "I don't think that's what this is it? Are you sure this is a linear narrative play?" And I read it again and went, "Oh, that's annoying. He's right. It's not. It's not a linear narrative. It's that story, but that's not it." And now it's a weird monologue. But it might morph into something else again, because I'm still thinking about it. I still have unfinished business with it, and I'm still not showing it to lots of people because it doesn't quite feel like it's found its place yet. So I think never give up on them. Keep them there. Let them. There's things go on in the back of the head, even if you're not looking directly at it. But give it the chance to exist in different forms.
Yeah.
Change it up. Be brave about kind of changing the form or exploding it, or
writing a scene that happens sort of 5 years before the opening of your scene, or 10 years after. Like, try and pinpoint other ways of releasing what it is you want to write about, because sometimes if you get a bit stuck, it might just be you've chosen the wrong bit.
Yeah, you haven't come in quite the right door.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Going back to the thing about time, when you're writing, is there a certain point in the process when you have settled on the question that the play is going to be about? And does that question ever change when you're writing?
So in an ideal world, you know that question before you put pen to paper. But sometimes you don't, because you're so eager to get this thing down on the page. And then you get to the end of it and you go, oh, hold on, I need to decide what the anchor is, because we could go this way, we could go this way, we could go that way. Sometimes you think you know what it's about, and then it's not about that at all, actually. You're like, oh, I thought it was all about that, but it's not. So I think just remembering it's all an inexact science, and that there is something that's not conscious about some of the writing. I mean, for me, that's the funnest bit, the bit that's not conscious, that's sort of, and trust those things. Things will come out and you'll be like, oh, wow, there's a lovely like little link or an echo here, or this has happened and I never intended that, or I don't think I intended that, but something intended that to happen. And I think to trust that, and just don't be hard on yourself. You know, don't listen to people who say things like, you must write every day or you're not a writer. It's just not true, because who can write every single day? You know, and it's more about the act of thinking about things, thinking about the world, being interested. And if you get stuck on stuff, go and watch a play or go and watch some telly. You'll find inspiration in other places. I think we just have to be easy on ourselves, because writing is really hard, and it's really vulnerable making. It's a deeply personal act. You're putting something into the world, and it's a really brave thing to do. So I think you have to be very kind to yourself, and just remember that like no one has any answers, but might have suggestions that might be able to kind of nudge things in the right direction. But I think a question is useful, even if it doesn't end up being the question, because it does help anchor you.
It's good focus, isn't it?
Yeah.
How are we doing for time, Georgia? Are we there? Are we over? Oh, have you got a question? Are we done? That was so brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was so lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.